Okay, so I don't think many of you know, but I have lived in this area for quite a while. I used to live in Rochester, New York, which is right across from Lake Ontario. But in all these years, I had never learned to say Toronto correctly. So it's the first time today, thanks to the stickers, that I'm actually able to say Toronto instead of Toronto, like I usually used to say. So thank you very much to TELUS for welcoming me here, and to all the sponsors. It's fantastic to be in Toronto. It's a lovely city, and I've always enjoyed coming here. So my topic today is to talk about two other elements of digital transformation that are super important to a successful digital transformation. And my role from an open source practice perspective at Comcast is to enable digital transformation in the company through a couple of those elements. One being open source, and the other being how do we create a more inclusive, more vibrant, and engaged community, both inside companies and in open source. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of my journey in open source as well as in inclusion, I started off at Silicon Graphics in '95, I think. And it was around '98 that we started seeing that Linux and open source was going to be super powerful, super important for enterprises to use and adopt. So we started shipping Linux-based x86 servers as a company, and that therein began my journey in open source. As a product manager inside the company, I had to learn how to work with open source communities, what the business model of open source was going to be like, and what it meant to be an open source community member as a corporate entity like Silicon Graphics. A lot of companies like IBM and SGI and HP, which were the early corporate entrants, if you will, into open source, had to learn how to balance their marketing efforts. You couldn't be too corporate. You needed to embrace community. You needed to be a little bit more, broad in your thinking and not just about your corporate brand. So it was a fun time in '98. From there, I went to a small startup called Tripwire, which is in the security space. And Tripwire also was struggling with how do we embrace open source as a startup. They had started from the roots of a freeware software, and they had made it proprietary, and now they realized that if they wanted to achieve ubiquity with their product, they needed to open source their product, and also enable people to experience the product, and then they could create a business model of upsell to a commercial product from the open source. So I was responsible for working on the open source strategy for Tripwire. And then fast forward a couple of years, I started at Wind River Systems, which is a part of Intel, and I was running the Wind River Linux distribution team. And our job was to create a commercial Wind River Linux, if you will, in a space, in the embedded space, which is famous for rolling your own distributions. It's a custom space. People make their own custom distributions. So you had to really articulate how companies add additional value on top of open source to a distribution and bring additional safety, if you will, and risk mitigation to an enterprise who's adopting open source. I then ran the open source office at Western Digital SanDisk, which really goes to tell you that even hardware companies like SanDisk and Western Digital, which are in the storage space, needed to establish an open source office so that they could understand how to work with the community, how to contribute correctly, how to be a member of that community. A number of other initiatives that I'm engaged in. I joined the Linux Foundation Board of Directors a couple of years ago, and it's because one of my passions is to enable companies and community to work better together. And the Linux Foundation has really established itself as an organization that houses multiple projects across the board to enable communities and companies to work more successfully and to create a more sustainable ecosystem, if you will, for open source. I am involved in the Women of OpenStack and also the Women of Open Source at the Linux Foundation. And we are really broadening also this from gender diversity to inclusion of all kinds. And that brings me to my journey to Comcast. And I'll talk more about Comcast's digital transformation journey and how open source plays a role in that. Super proud to be at Comcast right now. I joined about a year and a half ago. I'm based in Silicon Valley, but I work out of Philadelphia quite a bit. So Toronto was easy to come to from my journey. So I think everyone today has been saying this to you. Digital transformation is impacting all of us. Every single industry by far is being impacted. And we're all on some stage of the journey, if you will, in the digital transformation journey. And there are many, many reasons that bring you to transforming yourself. One could be competition. There are a lot of new upstarts, new startups, disrupting the models in your industry, and you need to deal with that. Or it could be that all of a sudden there's this perfect convergence of different technologies, different practices, different mindsets that allow us to establish new models of working with our customers. Or it could be that problems these days, problem sets are so connected, so large, that we all need to work together in a more collaborative way to solve these problems. No matter what, digital transformation is here, and we all have to acknowledge it. But the transformation, it's, I think, very narrow to think of transformation as just webifying something, or to have a mobile strategy around something, or to create a digital product. If you are a paper product, creating a digital product, that's really narrow. It's not just about those things. It really fundamentally recasts and makes you rethink how you are going to deliver your product or your service to the market end to end. And I think Sean did this, talked about it very, very effectively. It's recasting, recreating, reimagining, rethinking how you are working with your customer. Think Uber, I mean, how we used to haul a taxi or how we rented cars versus the entire transformative experience of Lyft and Uber in terms of how you book it, how you use it, how you pay for it, how you interact with the whole service is different. So transformation really touches every single aspect of the business, and it allows you to create a brand new world, if you will, of experiences. And the content or the tools that we use to create digital transformation, to do digital transformation today, is often software. And software is the fuel, the gasoline, if you will, that allows us to go fast and to really transform experiences. And if you look at software itself, you find that most of us are using open source methods of creating software to transform the world. So open source is eating software, which is eating the world, if you will. And why is open source software so prevalent? And why are we all using so much open source software? This slide comes from the Linux Foundation. And by the way, it's already old. This was a few months ago. It was 64 million plus. Now it's 78 million plus repos on GitHub. And GitHub, thanks GitHub, is becoming the place where software goes to be created. There's so much software, and the velocity and the momentum behind open source is so huge that you can find so many different components to create what you need to create and ride on the shoulders of giants, if you will. And it's also in various areas of technology. It's not just innovation in certain infrastructure components. In the old days, it used to be in Linux and file systems and web and things of that nature. But now, whether you're talking about trusted ledger systems through blockchain, or you're talking about big data, or IoT and the digital home, or the cloud, or mobile, or AI, all of these different tools that we need to do the digital transformation, open source is the leading edge in all of those areas. I remember when I was at Silicon Graphics, we were more about saying, what are the gaps between Linux and IREX, which was our operating system, and what do we need to contribute from IREX to make Linux equal to, what IREX was? And today, Linux is on the leading edge, open source is on the leading edge, and proprietary struggles to kind of keep up with the leading edge. And this slide comes from the folks at Black Duck. And their survey, and the numbers are a little old, but it still stands. 78% of companies like us use open source. When I do due diligence of acquisitions or mergers for the company, I typically don't believe the team when they say, oh, we don't use any open source. Frankly, every single one of us, through vendors that sell to us or through downloading from the web, use open source. There's only less than 3% don't use open source of any kind. And how has Comcast transferred the way we watch TV? It was around about 2000s, I think, the year 2000, 2001. My boss talks to me about how he did his first contribution, I think, to the HTTP project or some other project at the Apache Foundation. But we, like Sean was saying, we also relied very heavily on vendors. And we were buy, procure, integrate, and deploy and operate type of company for a very, very long time. And we realized that we needed to be more in touch with our own destiny. We needed to be transforming our customer experience. We needed to be relevant. We needed to be very sound from our long-term strategy and a transformation strategy perspective. And in 2012, we launched what was called the X1 Entertainment Operating System. And this is both a cloud-based as well as a set-top box-based application system that allows you to aggregate and search for content on your set-top box across many different content sources. It could be live TV, it could be services like Netflix, Hulu, Pandora, or it could be on demand or on your DVR. But the power of providing control to the customer to be able to search the content was a huge breakthrough. And then to enable the voice-activated search such that you could just use plain English to say, show me Game of Thrones, or show me the Wicked Witch of the East. And it would then bring up all of the movies that correspond to that. Was powerful. You didn't need to remember numbers, you didn't need to remember channels. And then we went on to doing more live streaming. So when you get your set-top box, you also get live streaming on your phone or your iPad. And we are a deliverer of high-speed internet into people's homes, which is one of the fastest growing pieces of the business, along with business services to small, medium, large. Which really, the culmination is that behind all this, behind the logo, is a lot of technology that powers how we deliver services to customers. And a lot of this is built on open source, is built by teams who both consume open source but also contribute to open source and work with open source communities. And frankly, open source really changes the way you behave inside the company. And part of my job is transforming our development culture. It's transforming our purchasing culture. It's transforming our compliance. It's transforming how we engage with communities, how we work with foundations like the Linux Foundation, how we work with other organizations like TELUS, like GitHub, like IBM, like Microsoft. In open source, one of the things I love the most is that you don't often wear your corporate hat. You really wear your open source hat and you work collaboratively across these companies. To me, it changes the way you develop. Our teams are not just thinking, I've got to invent it here, I've got to create it here. One of the first things all of these architects do and all of these teams do is go look and say, is there something else out there that solves this problem? Or is there something that's become a de facto standard? Or is there something that has a vibrant community, an ecosystem behind it that I can use? So think open first is one of the principles that we've been talking to the teams about. And also develop with the mindset that one day this could go open, that this would be something we would contribute. Because the way you architect your product and the way you architect your project is so different when you start with an open mindset. You do it more modularly, you document it better, you create it for maximum engagement and involvement from your communities. You post your issues, you create inner source within your company. So that's one of the pieces that we have said to teams. It also changes how we procure products. In the old days, you typically go to a commercial vendor and you provide your requirements and you select your product, you buy licenses, you monitor your proprietary licenses, you pay your bills, you get customer support from that vendor. You also provide feedback to the vendor in quarterly business reviews, and you say, this is the set of issues we have, here are the gaps, and you kind of hope that the vendor delivers to you, in a timely fashion. And it's completely different now. When you're working in open source, you better be at the table of the open source project. You better contribute code. You need to be there and show up and influence the project, engage the project, get involved in the project, contribute to the project, support the project. And often projects also have vendors, have consultants, and services providers. And as a user, as a consumer of open source, we need to be there sharing our use cases, our issues, our contributions, so that vendors can adopt it, the whole ecosystem can grow as a result of that. So the way you influence, the way you work with procurement is different. One of the other questions that I've added to the procurement process is, if someone's selecting a commercial product, I often ask, so have you considered the open source alternative? Why aren't you using the open source project in this case? And teams have very valid reasons why they choose commercial versus open in many cases, and that's perfectly good. But I want them to think about what the open source equivalent is and whether that's something that's ready to be consumed or not. It's changed the way we recruit and retain people. So our logo a few years ago was really not known for being a technical company or being on the cutting edge of technology. And sometimes it's hard to recruit good developers, especially in the open source arena, when you are not known as an open source company. And so one of the main tasks that I had was, how do I communicate to developers out there that we are an open source first company, we are an open source friendly company. So a ton of the work that I do is to transform the brand, is to work around the brand and make sure that people know that we have very friendly open source policies, that our developers use the best open source tools, that we are members of open source communities, that we contribute back to open source communities, that people can continue to work on their pet open source projects if they want to, that we are a developer-centric culture. So that's really helped from a development perspective. And then that really leads to, and I've already talked about the branding, right? The brand is, yes, we were a cable company, but we are at the intersection of technology and media, that we enable and transform people's consuming of media, of the internet. And so it's all about making sure that people know that we are not just the old brand that they knew, that we are different today. So, one of the first things you understand when you see that software is the fuel behind the digital transformation is you realize that the developer is the heart of the transformation. So you become very people-centric, and developers are why and why we all fight for good developers, why we all want to create inclusive cultures, we all want to create a transformed organization because we need the best developers on board. And some of the things that developers care about, both from surveys as well as my own discussions with developers, is they want to know that you have a friendly open source policy in the company. A lot of us grew up on Git. We all have projects we've contributed to. And I know the Node.js population is very prolific, very passionate, very active in the community. And they want to know that the company has friendly policies that, that I outlined before, which is I can contribute to projects, I can do open source on my own time, that it's not going to be months and years of legal and bureaucratic, oversight before I can contribute anything or do anything with open source, and that we are heavily engaged in open source communities. And those are all important factors to my team, and we do that. We make sure that we communicate that we have a very friendly policy. Inclusive leadership, and I'll talk a lot more about this. I think it's so important when you're dealing with people, with human beings at the heart of the digital transformation, that they feel valued, that they feel included, that they feel that they belong, that they can be themselves, that they can come with their whole selves to work and not just, their work persona. And leaders today, among other qualities, have to demonstrate that they know how to manage teams across the globe, across geographies, across gender, preference, abilities, etc. And that is one of the most important success stories, I think, for the digital transformation, is who can do it better than anybody else and who can attract the best people to their company. Company brand, we talked about it. I know a lot of developers also want to work on cool technologies, and they want to know, does your company work on Node.js, and does it work on Kubernetes? And those are some of the technologies that I want to work on. And so we are very present in some of these communities, and we make sure that we are demonstrating that we do use the latest technology, we do work in that technology. And I think Sean mentioned this as well. Culture eats strategy every single day, for lunch, breakfast, dinner, right? And it's because, as we discussed in the slide before, people are at the heart of technology and at the heart of the transformation. So if you can have the latest tools, the coolest gadgets and everything else, but if you don't engage your teams, if you don't have a culture that supports innovation, that helps innovation, that makes people feel like they want to come to work every single morning, then all of your strategies, all of your brilliant work will go to waste. And again, I'll iterate, it really involves inclusive leadership. It means people feel like coming to work. People feel that they are understood and valued, right? And why inclusion? So just talking more about inclusion. And there's a business case for inclusion, not just the feel-good part of inclusion. The business case to me is, if we are going to redo this world, if we are transforming this world through digital transformation, if we have this chance to rebuild the internet and rebuild how services are delivered, should we not reflect the people that are going to consume those services? So if the world is 50-50, men, women, should not the teams that build this world also reflect that? Should the world not reflect the diversity of the globe, the diversity of abilities, the diversity of languages and thinking and cognitive abilities, etc.? So it is very practical that if you are recreating the world, you should reflect the world in the people who are recreating it. And frankly, AI will tell you, and a lot of the algorithms we write will tell you, that it is what we build into it. We are the writers, we are the authors as developers of code, and whatever biases we bring to our work shows up in the code, and then demonstrates the bias. And there are many, many stories of bias built into the code because, unconsciously we put it in there, whether it is how we think of a certain community or how we think of, the very narrow way we may cast a certain test. There's a famous test about, I guess, the seatbelt in cars being tested often by, male engineers, and they forgot to take into account how small women could be and how the seatbelt could affect a woman sitting in the same seat. So it is really to reduce bias in all the work that we do. And third, we've talked about engaging employees. I know, for one, I love coming to work every single morning because I feel that my boss understands me. He gives me a very safe and secure environment to work in. I feel I'm valued for what I bring to the table. I feel I can make mistakes and not be judged for them. That people understand that I have a family, I have a life, and that I'm not just a drone who works at work and just goes home. And it makes me feel valued. It makes me feel understood. And I think many employees will say they feel more engaged at work when they are understood and they're cared for and they're included in decisions, in how it impacts them. And there are lots and lots of studies from McKinsey and others which show that there's a bottom line impact to inclusion, that there is more innovation through a diverse group of people working on a problem than a very homogeneous set of people. And we're not talking gender, we're not talking color, et cetera. We're talking even cognitive diversity, when there are people who approach a problem in very, very different ways, then they solve the problem in a very unique and interesting way. And the reason why culture and gender, et cetera, become important to cognitive diversity is because our life experiences impacts the way we approach things, right? And it colors the way we approach things, so that brings the cognitive diversity to the work. And frankly, in an age where we constantly lament that we have such a shortage of technical talent, such a shortage of diversity, of developer talent, shame on us if we don't look at all pools of recruitment, that we look at only the narrow, same pool that we've always recruited from. We really need to be broadening our horizons in terms of the pools that we recruit from, and also prepare people to come into the company. Not everyone's going to be ready from day one. Even frankly, people coming out of a top-notch school with a computer science degree, there's a huge gap between what college teaches you and what you would do at work, right? And so you really need to do either boot camps or do some sort of hand-holding and prepping to bring people into your way of thinking. Frankly, every company has a different workflow, different set of tools, different culture. And so you can't just expect everyone to come in and hit the ground running. We as companies need to invest more in our people and getting them ready to succeed. And last but not the least, we are a global world. And I love what Canada does. I think Canada is such an inclusive country rather, and such an inclusive culture. And even from the ads on TV to the people in the legislature to Prime Minister Trudeau, it's such a great country. So you guys get it more than anybody else. And we are global. We learn a lot from being global, and we can't see it as a threat. We need to see it as something that works for us. So I think fear is the thing that seizes us the most as people. I think we fear that we are giving up our privilege maybe, or our position in the hierarchy, or what we used to have, and we don't want others to get that. And I think once we overcome that fear and we embrace the change that's happening and we invest in people, we start seeing the benefits of the digital transformation. It's that whole holistic experience that we want to deliver to our customers. So let me end with saying it really succeeds when you have an open and inclusive culture. And I hope that I've convinced you that inclusion and openness is one of the most important keys to driving digital transformation, which we're all going through. And if you want to know more about what we do, our open source projects, some of the open source roles that we have, you can check out our GitHub page. You can also follow me on Nithya Ruff on Twitter if you have any questions or you want to follow up. Thank you again.